Welcome to the Theological Family Ministry Podcast, a podcast for parents as well as children and youth ministry leaders. We are dedicated to showing how theological study and biblical application relate to the discipleship of children and youth. As always, we're hosted by Pastor Ben Palaz, the pastor of Family and Children's Discipleship at Curtis Baptist Church in Augusta, Georgia, and Tony Trusoni, the family and student pastor at Faith Family Church in Finksburg, Maryland.
All right, Tony, how are you doing, man? It's good to be back with you.
I'm doing well. I got some sleep after that last podcast we recorded, and it's weird recording a podcast now that will come up this week as of the recording after we've recorded a podcast that will come up in 2 weeks. So it gets a little confusing and hard to keep track of, doesn't it?
Yeah, I'm glad I've got a little more space than I did last night. I was crammed into my closet, but it was a little warmer there in my closet than it is in my office with cinder block walls and exterior facing walls. So I had to turn the heater off too, so you don't hear the buzz. So Tony, I've got a question for you. You're a history guy, right?
I am a history nerd. Okay,
so what's the most recent book of history you've read, or the most interesting that stands out to you?
I'm reading I'm listening on Audible to a biography about President Grant right now by John Edward Smith, and I'm really enjoying that. So, John Edward Smith, rather, I think. So I've been enjoying that.
And you've kind of been into the presidential biography thing, right?
Yeah, definitely. I've gotten into a lot of them. I actually really enjoyed, there was one about Truman. I don't remember the author recently, and that was really a blast to me.
Okay. Yeah, I've listened to a few memoirs from recent presidents, and have found those interesting. And there's lessons to be learned. I imagine you've picked up some things just at different points. Well, today we have a guest with whom we have history. You and I have a long history, and that history dates back to when we had a history with this guest. And he is a specialist in history, among other things. So we want to welcome today Dr. W. Brian Shelton. He served as a provost in Northeast Georgia and a professor of theology at several different Christian colleges. Welcome to the TFM podcast, Dr. Shelton.
Thanks so much for having me on Theological Family Ministry podcast. It's an exciting one, and it's nice to reunite with both of you.
Amen.
Well, today we brought him in. I had hoped to do this before Reformation Day, but that came and went, and I thought, well, let's just reach out to him anyway, because I know that you're a big fan of Martin Luther. Have you done any writing on Luther?
I have not written much on Luther. At the turn of the millennium, I had proposed a book on Martin Luther for millennials because there were so many issues like angst and identity that I felt like millennials really related with, but it was rejected and it never got written. But I do like Martin Luther, and it was really coincidence. You probably saw the blog recently on the contributions of Luther. I like him because he's exciting and passionate and focused, but at the same time, he has a lot of theological breadth, and he recognizes the value of theology in all areas of life. And in particular, as I think of both of you, after went on from undergraduate to a seminary that is recognized as having a strong Reformed element, I suppose I like Luther because he kind of balances a lot of the triumph of Calvin that you see in books and in kind of popular discourse.
Okay. So yeah, I didn't know, I guess, the level of interest or that you had proposed a book, but I knew some of that. And just that your background was in church history, even though you're teaching primarily theology when we were students of yours in college. But does what happened in the history of the church really matter for us today? And even closer to home, we focus on ministry to children and youth and to the family at large. But does it matter for kids and youth today?
Church history is super valuable in a couple obvious ways, both of which I think matter to kids and to youth. The first way is identity. Church history tells us who we are and where we came from. For example, every denomination like Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodist has a story of convictions and even separation from other Christians. Symbols like IHS and the Chi Rho, which looks like an X and a P that will hang on the Christmas tree, they have a backstory in our history. Our beliefs about Jesus are based on the Bible, but the church still had to interpret, and they had some debate and had to resolve some fundamentals in venues that we call church councils. All of these reflect our identity. A second way I think church history is valuable is it does have power for instruction. Church history relates the experiences of God's people for us with lessons of what to do right and what we've done wrong. For example, when our nation is threatened with war, good thinkers can go to the early church father Augustine and read his work on just war, where he provides some criteria for thinking through if a war is defensible. Individual stories, they can also instruct us. I'm thinking of the same Augustine. We view him as a super righteous monk who wrote valuable theology about God. But his autobiography, called Confessions, describes how he was a thief, a fornicator, a philosopher who longed for truth in various religions before he became a Christian. People in church history can't get their locker open and they feel left out by their friends. Dante was so in love with a woman named Beatrice that he couldn't eat and was devastated when she married another. And it's reflected in his writings and theology. So those are a couple ways that kind of encapsulate all church history and its value for everybody.
That's awesome. Thank you. I think it's interesting that we get to talk to you about this because in a lot of ways, Ben and I poked around about my nerdiness about history and sometimes his as well. But my real great passion is often historical theology. And I largely really gathered that from your historical theology class at TFC. And I really want to thank you for that.
Well, I appreciate that. I remember you both as really good students. I don't remember you as history nerds as much as I just remember you as nerds. And of course, I'm just kidding. For your audience, you're both super cool. But those were great days, and you were good students, and I appreciate the interest that we share together.
Wonderful. So,
thank you for the kind words.
What are some of the most important lessons we can learn in general through the study of history of the Lord's Church?
I'm thinking kind of three categories of important lessons. Church history helps us realize, first of all, simple people can do amazing things with God's help. Brother Lawrence is known to us today from the 17th century because he experienced only satisfaction and peace, he said, when he served as a mere cook and a sandal maker for other Carmelite monks, and then also served the poor in the same way. In 1985, Henry Nouwen left his professorship at Harvard to join l'Arc community in France, spent 9 months living and sharing in life with people, many of whom had learning disabilities. And so that simple people have done great things, I think, is kind of a first group of lessons that are always available. Second, the church sometimes loses. We experience unfriendly cultures and we can be persecuted. We have debates, and sometimes the biblical answer doesn't win. We encounter corruption. We've seen it in history, even sometimes among church leaders, and it brings embarrassment to the body of Christ. We take these losses, we recover from them, and we move on for the cause of the kingdom on earth. But those lessons are also in church history. And third of all, I think, one of the great exciting things about history is we can see that God is at work in the world. Early church councils battled, and they battled over how Jesus could take on flesh and still be God. This doctrine of Jesus' person is essential for our faith, and we believe the most honoring view of Jesus won out. The church should be recognized for starting orphanages, recovery shelters, hospitals, schools, and universities. Christians do great things throughout church history, and by studying it, one realizes that God works through his people to show love as the gospel and to preach words as the gospel both. I think all of those are kind of valuable categories of ways we can learn from church history.
I actually really like how you pointed out the ways in which studying history shows us about the times that the church lost. And I think that is so relevant to today. I mean, even to families that I think live in a culture where we feel like Christianity is losing, where we feel like the kingdom is really being set back, and we can be so often hopeless. But I think we get refreshed hope when we study Christians that have lived in times such as those in the past and have been faithful and how God has worked.
Yeah, I would second that. What are some engaging ways you think that we can introduce church history to kids and youth in a way that piques their interest, or is it illustrations, is it a class on it? What are your thoughts?
Stories. Tell them dramatic stories of perseverance, such as Luther renamed, standing against the Holy Roman Empire. Tell them sacrificial stories, such as Mother Teresa among the poor in Calcutta. Tell them stories of discovery, such as the monk Gregor Mendel observing the genetics of pea plants. There are a plethora of stories which can be told in class, on retreat, around a campfire, or even in a car on the trip. Now, of course, in order to teach our kids and youth about church history, we have to know a little bit about it. And so there are lots of church history books, and even though those might be instructional for parents or youth workers to be able to tell stories, the truth is a lot of those resources, they're good for kids and youth to look at. I know that later, listening to your podcast, you might ask me about recommendations for people to be able to read, and I have a couple. For now, simply to say that there are church history books that are themselves engaging. To have them around the house means that a child might open it and look at the pictures and begin to understand the history of the church, but also to imagine, because imagination is an important part, including even of stories. So those are maybe the most engaging ways, I think, that we can introduce this important topic with all of its treasures to kids, to youth, and even to adults.
The power of story is, I think, every culture that I'm familiar with, at whatever time, has enjoyed telling stories, and it just has the ability to grip our imagination in a way that prose does not, or an outline. And I'm looking here at your blog, and I had seen several months back that you had written about Quest for the Historical Apostles. I think I'd seen a number of years before you've written about martyrdom, and so I'm sure there's a number of interesting things that you've picked up along the way. And so all of that, I could see how it would inform that.
The martyrs are some of the most exciting stories. And the apostle stories center on the book, Quest for the Historical Apostles, that I wrote. And their stories sometimes feel untrue, sometimes true, and sometimes we don't know. But either way, they're absolutely fascinating. And they describe, values that we still share. What it means to be rejected and to suffer loss. What it means to go to a foreign country and be really foreign when we feel called by God. Stories are shared by us because we have links to the people and the experiences contained in the story. And like Solomon, we realize that there's nothing new under the sun. And that's why church history can be so important and such a quality teacher for us all.
That's good. So now, what are some interesting stories and people from church history that would catch the interest or curiosity of young people? And I think that's Ben actually wrote these questions, and I think it's a great question to ask, as especially I try to enliven my kids in that kind of thing, and I notice how church history can really light them up too.
Where do you begin answering the question about fascinating stories and people from church history? We mentioned Martin Luther a couple times. I think he's a classic, not because he stands large on the timeline, but because of the obstacles that he personally overcame. Few people have ever been so clearly documented as frustrated. In his case, overwhelmed by feelings of guilt